it's very easy to be negative about big tobacco, certainly, but big pharma. When you look at the PR that they've had, and for good reason. I'm not defending those industries, but it's very easy to be negative about what their entry might mean. And I think we have to look past that and look at the opportunity, and also consider, if you operate a cannabis business, what's the benefit for you?
No smoke, no fire? Big Tobacco is clearly making a play for cannabis. British American Tobacco's recent £75 million investment into cannabis firm Organigram is a strong indication of that. However, while the subject may be uncomfortable for many, we can't deny that tobacco's involvement in cannabis could benefit the cannabis industry in a number of ways, not least economically. We speak to Nick Kenny, a strategic advisor to large companies diversifying into highly regulated sectors, to better understand the challenges and opportunities. Hello and welcome to the Lobsterpot podcast. I'm Dave Barton, and November, it's a countdown to Christmas. Jamie, are you excited for what Father Christmas or Santa or whatever we're calling him these days is bringing you this year?
Do you know what? Total aside, I'm buying a house. So if I'm in by Christmas, that'll be gift enough. And if I'm not, then I'm going to burn everything down. But that's only a joke. I'm not really going to burn everything down.
Well, go big or go home, right?
Yeah, I mean, literally. I feel like we're both sort of being a bit let down that neither of us are going to Vegas for MJ Biz. So we're going to hold down the fort here.
Exactly. There's see what we can do from this end, and hopefully catch up with friends and colleagues after the fact to really get the 411 on all the cray-crayness that I'm sure will be going down, as in the next sort of week or so. But in the meantime, we have someone else who's not going to MJ BizCon this year, a gentleman by the name of Nick Kenny. He's a strategic advisor to large companies who are diversifying into highly regulated industries. Also from the side of tobacco into cannabis, and you work with those sorts of companies. So welcome to the show, Nick. Tell us a little bit about Big Tobacco. There's been lots of news. There's been Organigram, and acquired by British American Tobacco. Big Tobacco is making a play for cannabis. How do you see it from your side?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. I really enjoy what you guys are doing, and certainly educating the populace on what's going on in the world of cannabis.
Thanks, man.
I'll give you a quick analysis of my journey into the space and what experience I have in the background, and then we can talk about to your question, what is big tobacco? For me, I entered into the professional career as for a tobacco company. I did that for about a decade, primarily in the US market. And then my entry into cannabis actually was through a tobacco company. So I was US Director of Marketing for a company called Imperial Brands, which would, as we'll talk about in a second, is one of the big tobacco, or considered big tobacco. And the challenge there was how to educate a big corporation on the evolving cannabis industry, predominantly in North America, but also globally. I left Imperial back in 2019. I started my own advisory because that journey from pure education, informing a big corporation and the executives of that organization about the sector into making an investment was a really interesting 2 years. And subsequently, I felt that there were lots of organizations that were going to go through the same journey. And that's what I've done in the last 4.5 years. I've worked for a number of big tobacco, big alcohol, and essentially those big corporations that are looking at highly regulated markets. To your question on big tobacco, well, when we look at big tobacco, we predominantly talk about 4 of them. That's PMI, Philip Morris International, BAT, which you've already referenced as British American Tobacco, JT, and JTI as a subsidiary, which is Japan Tobacco, and Imperial, a Bristol-based organization here in the UK. Those are the 4 big tobacco companies. Now, there is another one that we don't really refer to in that context, which is CNTC, which is the Chinese tobacco company. And the reason for that is they predominantly don't operate outside of China. There are 26 houses in the CNTC. One of them is as big as an Imperial, as an example. So it's the biggest one by far, but it really only operates in duty-free and domestically. So that's really what we refer to as big tobacco. Now, obviously, there are a number of other companies down the line, Altria, Korean Tobacco, and a number of second tier and third tier in terms of size companies. But yeah, that's who we're referring to when we refer to big tobacco.
Awesome. And again, do you feel like, I mean, there's been a few plays, I think, in recent years for big tobacco in particular coming into cannabis. And I guess it kind of makes sense from perspective of outside looking in. You know, you've got it's plant-based, you know, you've got distribution networks, you've got all of the kind of working in regulated industries experience. Do you feel like it's a kind of natural segue? Is there a huge amount of interest from tobacco coming into cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think they are synergistic industries in many ways. If we refer to them as simply, they're both mature markets, but they differ in what that mature means. When we look at tobacco, from a regulatorily, commercially, and consumption-wise, it's a very mature market. It's very clearly regulated. In fact, getting more regulated. Commercially, obviously, is big revenues, globally operated, and as you said, through the supply chain, very, very mature. And then from a consumption basis, it hasn't really changed in 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. We still consume the same end product. In respect of cannabis, I would argue it's still also a mature market. The difference being is that it's been in the dark for 100 years. And what I mean by that is, from a consumption perspective, we arguably still, it's been used for 6,000 years for different purposes, but we still, with relatively less mature in terms of its consumption behavior, because although people have been consuming it, they've been consuming it through inhalation and less so through infusion and the other parameters that R&D is now seeping into cannabis. In terms of regulatorily, it's quite mature because it's prohibited, but now it's getting more and more light, and we're reviewing that process. And then certainly commercially, it's very mature. The difference being that it's in the illicit market, it's very mature. There are supply chains, there's distribution hubs, there are salesmen. You know, it's a very mature, clean path. It's just the difference being is it's not in the light, it's in the dark still. And so the challenge of traversing that is to how do you switch a very mature illicit market into a legal one? And that's the challenge for any corporation, any regulator, to find the right path. So in terms of tobacco looking at this sector, it is viewed as a synergistic. The difference now is that cannabis has so many more uses than the tobacco plant. And we know that through not just cannabis, obviously the hemp-derived products, and also the ways that you can consume cannabis are far more than the ways you can consume tobacco. Nicotine is somewhat of a separate matter. Yes, for sure there is considerable interest, but they're also hesitant. And the reason by that is tobacco is a very risk-averse sector. There's a lot of risk involved in diversifying out of your core product. And there's a number of stakeholders you need to consider when making moves. In general, tobacco looks at it through three growth engines. The primary one being tobacco, that's how they generate the majority of their revenue. The second growth engine being next generation products. So that would be your vape or IQOS or heat not burn devices, vape pouches. Those will be considered in that realm. And then the third growth engine would be the diversification into synergistic industries outside of nicotine and tobacco. And that's where cannabis would sit. And the idea is that over time, the revenue mix starts going from tobacco into those other two. It's still very early days, and the challenge and why interest is hesitant is there's no regulatory stability, there's no sizable revenue that you can really penetrate, and by way of that, you look at the US, the biggest market in the world, it's still federally illegal, so therefore there's no regulatory stability from entry, and so there's lots of considerations, but there's certainly a lot of interest. There's just a lot of hesitancy until that stability in terms of regulation. One other thing I will say is when you operate in the cannabis sector and you look at the likes of big tobacco, you think of huge checks, and the ability, once they enter, they're going to take over. They certainly have huge paychecks, but they're very careful how they invest their money. And the reason for that is because there's so many other factors you have to take in when you consider it. They have to consider the fact that where they're domiciled. For instance, if you're in the UK and you're domiciled in the UK, you run the risk of POCA, which is Proceeds of Crime Act, if you invest in a legal market, because it's not legal here. And that's just one aspect. Then you have to consider your agreement with banks and how they perceive an investment such as this, what your shareholders think. There's so many other things where making a minor investment may seem very simple and it's not a huge amount of money, etc. But those all things have to be traversed before you can actually say, okay, we're going to step in. And that affects all of them. But yes, in answer, a very long-winded response, but there's a lot of considerations when you take it into account.
Do you think that, I mean, tobacco is a massive industry with big players in it, big controlling players, have a huge amount of lobbying power, particularly in the US, where lobbying is, well, and the UK, everywhere really, but more known in the US, I think, more publicly known and a larger lobbying scape. Do you think that there is scope for almost kind of pre-entry lobbying? Do you think, or have you seen anything, heard anything like that? Is that what tobacco companies are doing, almost as if they can't really get in at the moment because federal illegality makes it far harder than they would like it to be? Are they waiting for it to be illegal, or are they helping to nudge that on?
It's an interesting question. I think we'd be naive to think that it hasn't been considered and that conversations haven't been had. As to how and what, that's not public knowledge, nor even if I knew it, I couldn't share it.
Fair enough, yeah.
I think it's certainly any, and it's not just tobacco, it's any big corporation, big alcohol, big pharma, any big industry is certainly looked at cannabis and has certainly made either a decision or a wait and see approach. And from that, we don't quite know where the resolve will be. I think it's coming, and the nature of what it looked like will determine how they enter. But for sure, I think it would be naive to think they haven't done so, or at least had those conversations to start with.
I suppose it's to do with the amount of money they got invested in it. I mean, I'm thinking about what did I watch? Painkiller recently on Netflix about the opioid crisis, and thinking, well, the Sackler family just basically paid off the FDA. I don't see that happening anytime soon because they haven't got that much money at stake. Not that I'm saying they would do that, but again, when you think about those kind of what happens behind closed doors, it makes you think, well, who actually wants this to happen and why, and how quickly do they want it to happen? And I guess if, thinking, again, this is just me thinking about the most straightforward, not necessarily the most ethical route, is, are those conversations being had? Is money changing hands? Who knows? That's not for us to speculate. But by the same token, it's almost as though, who wants this to happen and how quickly do they want it to happen? I guess if tobacco is naturally cautious, maybe pharma as well, and big alcohol as well. I mean, they're used to navigating all of the regulations, but at the same time, it's almost like, well, what's the incentive almost, isn't it?
You raise a good point, which is, look, each sector may have different end goals from cannabis. Pharma certainly is well versed, in medicinal applications and understanding over the counter and behind the counter medical implications of cannabis as a drug, as from medicinal benefit, as a cure. I think tobacco, and this is where probably the difference being, tobacco is very well versed in CPG, so consumer goods. And so therefore their take would probably be in the CBD and recreational market. And also in the R&D and IP protection areas, as well as mass distribution and navigating regulated industries and markets. So there might be quite a difference in terms of what their end goal might be, and then therefore how they enter into this space. And again, what I'm going to preface here is we're still commercially very, very early on in this industry. Consumers haven't made a clear path yet. The end product is still evolving. We're still learning about it. If you think about it, there are 140 plus cannabinoids in the plant. We truly understand the effect of maybe 10 of them. So, you know, there's a long way to go here. And that's what I preface in general. You know, yes, there are early plays. There's a lot of learning to be done, but we don't have mature markets yet, at least commercially in the light markets. And so therefore it's very hard to understand where this will go and how these companies will play in the future.
It's interesting to see how it kind of develops. I mean, we're speaking to you, someone who knows big tobacco pretty well, you know, in the grand scheme of things. You know, you've got a reasonably good understanding of it, I would say, after many years kind of working in a regulated space, particularly in tobacco. The kind of naysayers, or perhaps the people who want to protect what they would see as the kind of culture around cannabis and maybe the sanctity of choosing words, but the sanctity of the kind of how they see the plant and how it should be distributed or used or understood, are at best probably reticent about the idea of big corporations, tobacco, pharma, whatever it is, entering into the space. Now, my personal take is that it's an inevitability, and I think no matter how strongly you feel about it being wrong ethically or how they conduct their own businesses being bad, it's going to happen. So to me, there's like a point where it should be embraced. I mean, thinking along some of those ideas, what are some of the benefits that big corporations can bring to an evolving sector like cannabis?
Yeah. So first, I'd say that it's natural to have hesitation, especially when you've been an enthusiast and in the industry for 30, 40 years, fighting, well, as they say, the good fight of legality, being arrested for just consuming something that's now considered legal in many jurisdictions. So there's a natural protectionism and enthusiasm behind the authenticity of the plant, and therefore those who operate in the sector. However, you know, it's naive to think that as an industry evolves and gets bigger and therefore significant revenue, which is something they've been pushing for a while now, takes shape, that entry from bigger corporations with lots of money to spend is not going to happen. So, you know, there are lots of benefits for big corporations entering in, to a degree, professionalism, just in general, how approached, how to create and get the best out of the plant. R&D, as another example, significant funding being put into understanding the plant, its effects, consumer behavior and consumer insights, something that, for instance, big tobacco knows a lot about. You know, when you have very little ability to speak to the consumer, you have to understand the consumer a lot more. You have to understand how they think, how they approach products, why they make purchase decisions. So from that avenue, organizations such as that can bring a lot of that to the table. I mean, additionally, also a lot of money. So there are a lot of money to invest in the sector, and through across the supply chain. You know, not just from an R&D and brand perspective, from a retail perspective, distribution, cost of goods. So bring those down, make it far more accessible and affordable. There are lots of benefits. It's very easy to be negative about big tobacco, certainly, but big pharma. You know, when you look at the PR that they've had, and for good reason, I'm not defending those industries, but it's very easy to be negative about what their entry might mean. And I think we have to look past that and look at the opportunity, and also consider, if you operate a cannabis business, what's the benefit for you? It may not be beneficial to have someone like big tobacco purchase you. It may not, or invest in you. It may restrict your next steps, but it also may be advantageous. And then, so therefore, I'd look strong as to within your business and whether it's advantageous for you to have it. But then in terms of an industry in general, yeah, it's going to happen. The enthusiasts have to get past that negativity. What I will say is, my experience has been, when I first entered the sector and went to my first conference in Vegas in, I think it was 2017, 16, 17. MJ BizCon was in the Rio, 5,000 people in it. 80% of those going were the enthusiasts, those you'd expect to attend a cannabis conference back then. 20% being those in suits or consultants or from big companies under guises of, you know, other companies. Flip it a year. The next year, it was in MJ PisCon in the convention center in Vegas, 20,000 people, and the ratio had completely flipped. So professionalism, VC money, big corporations, it's going to happen. It is happening. And so you just have to think smart about what that looks like for you.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point about the kind of historical prohibited nature of the product, and the idea that a big corporation enters is almost an affront to the injustice of the past. But I think it's about understanding that both of those things can be true. You can have the benefit of a big corporation or a big industry being involved, and it still have a bad past, and you can still kind of get the best from it. I mean, the point on R&D from a farmer perspective is that if you can produce cannabis to a higher quality for less money, then more people will find it more easy to have access to medicine, and that to me is pretty important.
And like the Hearst Corporation as well, they're, traditionally, well, they were was it William Randolph Hearst sort of was part of that lobby to ban cannabis or make it illegal in the US, and now they're sort of throwing money behind it to kind of. So again, it almost feels sometimes like with bigger industries, like the sins of the past have an opportunity to be remedied in some form. It certainly looks like that from the outside looking in. Do you think people within the industry, within tobacco or pharma or whatever, have that sort of attitude? It's not that clear cut. I think we're just talking about from a very business perspective, it feels like, from what you've said, that people say, look, we see the need, we see the growth here, we see the potential, we have the opportunity to develop this and make it into something, long lasting in a kind of commercial sense. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's going to sort of take away what's special about the plant. It's just going to make it more readily available.
Yes. Certainly the attitude I would take. The tobacco of the 60s and 70s is not the tobacco of today. It is the people that work in those organizations. Over the last 20 years, there's been a dramatic shift, and the people joining now aren't looking necessarily to push the core products. A lot of hires in the last decade in those big companies are about hiring in the next generation of products. So there is a desire and necessity for big tobacco to change its outlook and to change its product profile. It has to survive, because there's only one way tobacco is going. And so therefore there's a need and desire certainly to diversify. And with that, the talent that they incorporate into their organization and the culture that's incorporated in has certainly meant that tobacco is always going to be looked negatively. There's no question, but it will take generational shifts to see what those organizations look like in the future. And cannabis is just one of many areas and sectors they'll look in to do that. So yeah, in answer to your question in terms of the culture and the aspects, yeah, it certainly is the case.
That's fascinating. I think there's again, it's about understanding and learning and sort of sharing that knowledge. And I think again, that feels like a big part of what the industry of cannabis is about as much as anything. It's like what has happened here might not happen here, or it might, or is there a way that we can take some of the lessons learned from other industries and bring them into something here? So I think again, it's all important, even if there is a stigma, and it's all about stigma at the end of the day, cannabis, tobacco, whatever, pharmaceuticals, and it's about finding a positive way forward. So I totally get that. Just a kind of quick question. I mean, what do you think, if we're looking a sort of a year ahead, do you think we're going to see any more sort of big acquisitions from tobacco into cannabis, or maybe even pharma or alcohol, into cannabis? Do you think that time is upon us?
I think it will be strategic. I think investments will happen, some public, some private. BAT's investment in Organigram, because it didn't acquire Organigram, it invested, but a significant amount, obviously. That to me is strategic. That is creating a subsidiary for their cannabis investments moving forward. When we look at investments in general, there are going to be investments in core areas such as those with significant IP behind the plant, those with something unique, whether it's a brand, whether it's R&D, So I think investments are going to happen over the course of time in the next certainly year. The question is, will we know about it, and will it be significant, or will it be minor investments continued? I think that's probably the likely scenario, because again, we're in a situation where there's regulatory instability. So yeah, until there's stabilization in the sector, it's unlikely you'll have massive investment. Now, there will be, I'm sure, CBD or certain market entries or certain investments in different jurisdictions. I mean, you look at what's happening in Japan, you look at what's happening in Germany, in Thailand, in Switzerland. There are lots of opportunities for investments in those areas, in those countries. So I think that'll happen, and I think it's going to continue to happen. I just don't think it will be necessarily significant. And then you fast forward a year, and some big tobacco has invested a lot of money, and I'll look like an idiot. But
we just don't know. That's the thing. Again, that's what you're saying. No one really knows. It's signs say yes eventually, but again, it's like the idea of US federal legalization. It's like, could be tomorrow, it could be 10 years. Who really knows? But again, I think looking at the sort of, now that half of, well, is it over 24 states now, isn't it, in the US are recreationally legal? Now Ohio's joined the gang, and we've got 38 states that are kind of medical legal. It feels like, changes within reach. And I think, again, it takes something like we have to be in the majority in order to kind of affect that change. And I feel like that's coming. And I think that will come out of the US, or certainly North America, more so than Europe at this point. And I think, again, that will have that trickle down effect, because culturally as well. But again, it's kind of a finger in the air a little bit.
We're all looking at whether there's going to be a domino. If one falls, will they all fall? And we've been saying that we said that about Canada. There was an expectation that the US would move quicker than it has. We've said it about Germany. And Germany, look what's happened there, the delays and the limitations of what that actually looks like. People have been talking about Czech Republic or Switzerland as being those vehicles. We don't know. Certainly what I would say is the UK is not moving anywhere quickly. And whether the domino effect happens in the west or the east of us, I think it will take a lot to move our framework. Or, who knows, a Labour government could decide that this is a big area they want to make pivotal in their first couple of years. We just don't know.
Well, it depends if Keir Starmer can stand the smell of cannabis or whatever it is. Apparently, what was he was saying the other day? So, well, there we go. But no, absolutely, it remains to be seen very much, even from the inside looking outwards and vice versa. But no, thank you so much, Nick. I appreciate you coming on the show and telling us what you know. So, good luck to you, and we will see you soon. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
All the best. Cheers.